Good afternoon and welcome to your Employee Handbook, keeping it current, keeping you covered. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Raleigh Merrill with GTM. In a moment, I'll introduce to you our presenter, but first, feel free to use the questions functionality to ask your questions during today's presentation. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can at the end of the presentation, and if we don't get to your particular question, we'll be sure to follow up with you the next day. Questions functionality is right there on the upper right of your screen. You'll see the little question mark inside that box. You can click right there to ask your questions. We'll be sure to follow up with you, and you'll receive an email later today with a link to watch a video recording of this presentation as well as a PDF version. Our presenter today is Jennifer Berry, GTM's HR consultant practice leader. Jennifer brings more than 20 years of human resources experience to the GTM team, including managing and advising on the HR lifecycle for many organizations, including small to mid-sized not-for-profit organizations to larger global organizations. Jen's experience includes advising on mergers and acquisitions, HR project management, HR and benefits compliance, cybersecurity compliance, and more. She's led HR and process audits, ERISA audits, employee handbook projects, benefits administration platform development and deployment, and has developed and delivered training on HR and benefits compliance. Jennifer's also consulted with clients in all areas of HR, including leave management, talent acquisition and termination, benefits enrollment, compliance, and ACA, HIPAA, COBRA, and state and federal compliance notices. And at this point, it's my pleasure to tap into all this great knowledge and experience and introduce to you and welcome Jennifer Berry.
Thank you very much, Raleigh, and welcome everyone to today's presentation. As part of today's session, we're hoping to provide helpful tips on not only creating a compliant employee handbook, but how to keep it updated, especially with the constant changes to the state and federal landscape, even if you have a small or no HR team. Ultimately, we want attendees to leave with concrete, actionable items related to their employee handbook. With that said, today's presentation will cover core handbook essentials, where we'll describe what to include and why each section matters, common gaps and template pitfalls, those areas that might be missed in your handbook and the risk associated with such gaps, New York State and multi-state updates, keeping you current on the states in which you operate and where you have employees, describing an employee handbook as a living document and how to keep up with constant changes and communicate those changes with employees. We'll provide you with a 2026 compliance checklist, making sure your employee handbook includes some of the most recent updates and required notices. And then finally, what all employers need to know about their handbook, what should be incorporated, and whether you have an HR team or not. So let's start our discussion about why your employee handbook matters. As HR consultants, we often hear from clients and prospects, hey, why do I need an update to my handbook? I just paid a lot to do it 2 years ago. Or, I only have a couple of employees. Why would I need an employee handbook? While there's no legal requirement for an employee handbook, many federal, state, and local employment laws require that employers notify employees of certain policies. There are also a number of state-mandated notices that must be communicated to employees on a regular basis. And finally, one of the biggest challenges employers face is retention of great employees, often due to not setting expectations, communicating culture, and providing guidelines. All of these items can be handled quite easily by simply utilizing an employee handbook to communicate and meet all these obligations. An employee handbook is often the most efficient way to satisfy certain regulatory and other notice requirements, as you can provide everything in one place. An employee handbook also provides one place for an employer to communicate internal employment policies. It allows employers to provide workplace rules and expectations, which is helpful, especially when new employees are onboarded. It also provides a resource that can be utilized by managers and employees alike should they have questions about the rules and policies related to their employment. In addition to having a resource that can not only be a communication tool and notice device, an employee handbook really allows employers to set the stage, describing to employees the great opportunities that exist by being employed by the company. It also creates efficiencies by being a one-step resource that often takes the place of employees contacting HR or their managers with simple questions. Like, for example, how many days do I get off a year? Which serves well, especially in smaller organizations when HR staff and their time are at a premium. Finally, it's a great resource for managers dealing with employee HR questions. When they may not really know the reason behind certain policies, they can reference these policies as written and point employees to do the same. What I want to emphasize is that a handbook is more than a compliance tool. It's your best communication tool for rules, guidelines, expectations, and culture. And most importantly, it's a strategic asset. An employee handbook is not just a collection of policies, it's a foundational risk management, communication, and cultural tool that protects the employer while setting clear expectations for employees. A handbook documents an employer's policies, practices, and expectations. It demonstrates good faith compliance with federal, state, and local laws and helps defend against claims of discrimination, retaliation, wage and hour violations, and inconsistent treatment. It shows that employees have been informed of workplace rules and standards, that policies exist and are applied consistently, and that the employer exercised reasonable care to prevent unlawful conduct. Next, let's move away from the generalities and discuss the meat of your employee handbook. What exactly should and can be put in there? As you can see, there are a number of foundational policies that should be the backbone of your employee handbook. Those policies include both the regulatory and compliance standards, some of the things that are required by law to be communicated to employees, but also workplace standards, which helps you set the stage for new and ongoing employees. It sets expectations, provides guidelines, and enhances culture. So let's take a look at some of these policies. First, the most regulatory compliance policies must be communicated and acknowledged by employees at least once on an annual basis. I usually recommend that these items be at the front of an employee handbook and should provide notice to all employees of the protections their employer provides as part of their employment. These policies include at-will employment statement for states that are at will, including New York State, a statement about equal employment opportunity and non-discrimination, harassment prevention for both sexual harassment and other harassment, discrimination and retaliation prevention, workplace violence policies, and whistleblower protections, to name a few. Next, certain workplace policies and standards of operation should always be included. For example, schedules, attendance, and punctuality. Employee classifications. It's important to distinguish between full-time, part-time, seasonal, as well as whether employees are exempt versus being non-exempt. Paid time off policies and leave policies are also very important. In addition to conflict of interest, code of ethics, progressive discipline, and many, many more, which we'll get into later in this presentation. Please note that New York State requires the sexual harassment policy to contain specific language and to be acknowledged annually. The policy and New York State's whistleblower policy is often overlooked by smaller employers, and we'll get into some of those requirements in a couple minutes. In addition to the sections already discussed, compensation, leave, and benefits section of an employee handbook is one of the most important. It's also an area that often requires the most updates. States like New York, California, and Massachusetts often add new types of leave and mandatory paid time off requirements that not only need to be incorporated into employer policies, but also need to be communicated to employees within a certain time frame and often require an acknowledgement from the employee that they not only received notice of the change, but they have reviewed the additional new state leave law and/or policy. Further, employees always have the right and need to know what an employer's pay and compensation schedules are and what benefits they're entitled to, the deductions being taken for those benefits in which they enrolled, etc. Communication of these policies is especially important during new employee onboarding, when new employees should be provided an introduction to the employee handbook and have an opportunity to review with HR during their onboarding. Topics that include employer policies around technology, social media, and safety are also very important, as the rules have changed so often over the last 10 years as technology has been enhanced and expanded. It's so hard to know what an employee should expect from their employer in all of these areas. First and foremost, I'm sure most of you cannot even imagine a world in which your workplace didn't require use of some sort of technology, whether it's due to needing to punch in and out, use of computers as part of a job description, or use of personal smartphones while on the job. With that said, it's important to let employees know your policies around the use of company devices, use of their own devices during the workday, and boundaries and consequences of misuse. It's also important and a requirement in states like New York to let employees know that employers have the right to monitor an employee's use of company systems, including email, internet, social media, and phone use. New York requires that this notice be provided to all employees and that all employees acknowledge receipt of this notice. By adding such a notice to the employee handbook, you can easily communicate the notice and get the acknowledgement by employees. Data privacy and security policies are also very important to communicate. If you handle personal or confidential employee or customer data, if you have employees accessing files and systems remotely, and if personal devices are used for business purposes, employers need to be sure that employees know the standards and procedures for such care and use. This is not only important for employer compliance, but can save an employer thousands of dollars in fines for not meeting cybersecurity and state reporting guidelines. Workplace safety is also something that should be included in an employee handbook. This can be part of your safety and security section, or it can be added to your workers' compensation policy and reporting requirements. This is another area where employers could be on the hook for noncompliance if employees are not reporting workplace illnesses and injuries. So please be thoughtful about fully communicating what is expected of employees in this arena. Whether your employees are all office workers or employees operating heavy machinery, this section of your handbook is very important. Acknowledgements, which we've mentioned a number of times due to some of the notice requirements in New York, are really in being able to rely on them. We already talked about the handbook being a tool for communication and compliance. Many of the policies that are included have notice and acknowledgement requirements. Those are electronic monitoring, sexual harassment policy, New York HEROES Act, exposure prevention plan notice, etc. New York has quite a few of those required policies. An employee handbook without a signed acknowledgement also reduces the protections it can help provide should an employer need to resolve an employee dispute or performance issue or audit question. So with that said, please get an employee acknowledgement if you are utilizing an employee handbook. Please note that in New York, most states authorize electronic distribution of handbooks and acknowledgements, and everything can be completed electronically or online. The key is storing them where you can retrieve them. If you cannot post handbooks electronically or cannot employ an electronic acknowledgement, please be sure to collect physical acknowledgements, specifying the notices that require such acknowledgement. This should be filed in the employee's employment records. Sometimes it's not the policies that are the problem. It's the employer not knowing how to create an employee handbook or when to update it. Sometimes the template is actually the problem. Let's get more into this topic. As many of you know, it's difficult for a business owner or their HR team to have the time or knowledge to appropriately create or update an employee handbook. We certainly hope that becomes a bit easier following this presentation, but we do understand how difficult a task this can be for employers. Often, when we do try to create an employee handbook, we refer to things that may be easier to access or resources that may not have been fully vetted, or in some case, just Google things. But this is not the best path forward and definitely not the right path toward a compliant handbook that is used as the valuable tool we have discussed thus far. If you look on the internet, you may find what appears to be a valid employee handbook template. The fact that there are many free templates online make it something that seems like an easy option. However, these templates may not be compliant, may only cover federal versus state and or multi-state law, and certainly only provide at best a starting point. Please note that starting somewhere is the right move. The problem is staying there without the correct guidance, research, or compliance, and then putting a template in place without revisiting it. With that said, let's discuss some of the downfalls of using a random template you may find online without further action. You may miss federal or state mandated policies enacted after the template was published. For example, certain areas change quite frequently across the year, such as leave or paid sick time in New York. New York is constantly coming up with new regulations or adjustment to those regulations over the course of the year. You may have outdated guidelines or definitions in certain policies. For example, New York sexual harassment policy is updated almost annually. So if you're looking at an old template that seems to be compliant, it may not be if it's out of date. Missing policies altogether. You may not know what you don't know. So if your template that you pull doesn't have all of the policies that you as your business operates needs to include, you may be missing out. It may also include generic language that doesn't appropriately connect to the policies to your company or your industry or your employees or your culture. And often these templates don't include an acknowledgement form or forms that don't meet certain state guidelines for those required notices that we've already discussed. Bottom line is it's great to have a starting point. We really encourage that. But it is important to do the research, engage a professional, and certainly, most importantly, regularly review and update the template based on the ever-changing employment landscape, both federally, statewide, and locally. Please note, there is a need to cover all states that you are doing businesses in or have employees in. You must provide certain state policies or notices in those particular states when you're either operating or have employees in those states. That could lead to a high volume employee handbook project that could conceivably take a very, very long time or be never ending. So whether you're working on your own handbook or working with a professional to create your handbook or need assistance with maintaining compliance and updates, you should still have a good handle on some of the new policies and updated policies that require regular review and likely will require updates more frequently than others. Let's take a look. As always, New York has had a busy year with new laws that affect employment, while other laws have had some minor updates and tweaks. New York has been among the most active states with employment law changes year after year. Let's discuss a few. First, paid prenatal law. If you joined our last presentation, we discussed that although not new, some New York employers may not be aware of their requirement to provide paid prenatal leave, which became effective in the state as of January 2025. New York State was the first state to provide this additional bucket of paid time off. Eligible employees may take up to 20 hours of paid leave for prenatal care. This is in addition to other state mandated paid time off. Next, as it usually does every year, New York updated the mandated language that must be included in your sexual harassment prevention policy and in your training. These rules change annually, so it's important to regularly review and update your policy to reflect this new guidance. Please note that the same changes need to be incorporated in your annual and new hire sexual harassment prevention training. Pay transparency. New York employers with 4 or more employees must include a job description and pay range in all job postings, whether they be internal or external. Since these are often public facing, this is an easy area for the state to audit, with penalties extending in the thousands of dollars. New York's electronic monitoring notice requires employers to provide written notice if they are monitoring email, internet, or phone while at work, even if not actively monitoring. So, if your equipment allows you to monitor, it means you are monitoring and need to notify your employees, getting a signed acknowledgement of their receipt and review. And finally, a relatively new provision in New York for retailers provides that if you have 10 or more employees, you must maintain a written violence prevention plan and provide annual training to employees. This notice should be reviewed and acknowledged annually. We will discuss this more in a few minutes. Even employers who do not think of themselves as using AI may be using it through other systems, whether it be via their payroll provider, their benefits administrator platform, or HRIS, or data management systems. This is often being used regularly via recruiting platforms that many employers use regularly. If your business does use AI, and I would assume you do in some way, shape, or form, you must include an AI in the workplace policy in your employee handbook. It doesn't need to be long, but it needs to exist. Your policy should discuss which AI tools are approved and for what purposes, must include a prohibition on entering confidential company or client data into AI platforms, must have a requirement that human oversight must take priority in employment decisions, and it must have an acknowledgement that non-discrimination provisions apply to AI use and how employees may raise concerns and to whom about AI related decisions. Next, pay transparency laws are expanding quickly. As of 2025, 15 plus states have enacted pay transparency laws. Even employers not subject to them yet should be aware that their employees may have access to pay information through other channels. As stated earlier, New York employers with 4 or more employees must include pay ranges in job postings. This applies to internal and external postings. This should be provided in a policy communicated to both applicants and employees. It often includes specifics as it relates to an employer's compensation philosophy, how pay ranges are reviewed and applied, internal equity, and how bonuses, commissions, and other valuable pay factor in. Please note that by posting pay ranges in job postings, it may also affect internal company culture. For example, transparency about pay may have internal employees asking why they do not make the top end of the range. Employees will often engage their managers in discussion about this. It is important that employees equip their managers with how to effectively communicate about their pay philosophy, maintain non discrimination and non retaliation during these discussions, and then also understand the company's pay transparency policy. Remote work policies are among the most commonly misused sections for small employers. Even a simple policy that defines expectations, device use, and data security goes a long way toward preventing disputes. Many employers struggle with this topic and thus do not officially establish a policy, often creating discrepancies on work arrangements and creating a culture that is unstable. A remote or hybrid policy should effectively communicate eligibility for remote and hybrid work, if appropriate, work hours and schedules while working remotely, use of personal devices, data security, confidentiality, and approval of work changes must also be noted in that policy. It's also okay not to offer remote working. I would still suggest having a remote work policy that states that. Obviously, certain industries cannot support remote work. Can you imagine, for example, someone trying to wait tables at a restaurant while working from home? I don't think that would be a possibility. In any case, it's important that employees who do work remotely know what is expected and required of them. This is particularly important for employees who work in other states, those who may travel to the home state for work periodically, and how that may affect employer compliance obligations and may have tax implications for both the employer and employee. This should be outlined in your policy. Employers have included a non Many employers have included a non-compete agreement in the offer letters that they may have given employees many years ago. They may still use them, and they may assume that such a provision applies to everyone. The reality is that these provisions are increasingly scrutinized and must be reviewed for enforceability by state and based on each job. There are many states, as well as federal legislators, who have proposed bills and laws that would make most non-competes unenforceable. Although the ultimate decision about non-competes is usually settled in a courtroom, most states are in favor of non-competes being unenforceable as they limit employees from pursuing alternative employment. Currently, New York courts apply a reasonableness test. Overly broad non-competes are frequently struck down. State and federal legislators are proposing new rules, so we'll have to update you on one of our next webinars on if that ever evolves into anything. But since there is currently very little advisory on whether non-competes are worth it, and if you're currently using them, we would suggest consulting with legal counsel and drafting a policy around that, including that in your employee handbook. If you do use them and it's referenced in your handbook, you should be sure that the language is clear and current. This table on this slide is particularly useful for HR professionals who need to quickly assess whether their handbook addresses leave requirements triggered by their current headcount. I would recommend pulling this slide when you receive the slide deck following the presentation. It's a great resource. I'd put it up at your desk if you're regularly managing leave, especially useful if you are a smaller company and are growing. Planning ahead will help set expectations for employees now. Your obligation to provide certain types of leave may change if you are growing or in transition mode. It's important to keep a regular eye on some of these areas of leave and to update your policy should your size change. All of these types of leave on this slide are mandatory in New York State and or pursuant to federal law. So if you are required to provide multiple types of leave, your handbook should note so. It should also explain how certain leaves and benefits work together and potentially run concurrently, how they pay and how the benefits are calculated, and what the employer's return to work policies are following each of these types of leave. If you have employees in multiple states, please be sure to provide the correct policies to the employees who are in those states. Please also be sure to have a policy for each type of leave that applies to your organization based on size. Finally, well-being doesn't need a dedicated wellness section in the handbook, but is a very important part of employee culture. Some policies we've already discussed promote employee wellness. For example, it shows up through the accommodation procedures, anti-bullying policies, EAP references, and reasonable workload expectations. It's more about tone and completeness than a checklist item. However, employees are often seeking what their wellness options are at work, whether their employer provides certain benefits or tools to promote employee wellness, etc. This makes it a great topic to include in your employee handbook, especially when trying to communicate culture and support. Topics that are often important for employees include mental health and wellness, reasonable accommodations for disability and pregnancy, workload schedules, remote and hybrid work and communications, and anti-bullying and workplace civility. So we just explained that it required a bit more guidance than just grabbing a template for an employee handbook. But what if you do have an HR department, or even if you don't, what if you don't have the capacity or knowledge to get a new handbook or update done? It's okay if you don't have an HR team. You can start the process, you can build from there. Don't let the desire to have a perfect handbook stop you from starting and making progress. You do not need an HR department to have a solid and reliable handbook. You simply need the right priorities and a plan to revisit it. You can also reach out to valued HR experts like your HR consultant. But if you want to start building an employee handbook on your own, you can follow this guideline as a start. First, start with the compliance pieces. What is legally required by federal, state, and local law? Also be sure to include state and local law from all places where you operate your business and or have employees, even if they are remote. Some of these policies include at-will statement, equal employment opportunity, sexual harassment prevention, electronic monitoring, employee classifications, and pay. These are the non-negotiables in New York State. Next, add your workplace rules and create a culture. This is where you can talk about schedules, conduct, discipline. This is where you set expectations for all employees. Next, document paid time off and leave policies. State like New York usually require a minimum paid sick leave and safe leave, paid family leave. New York also has prenatal leave, as we've discussed. Remember that if you have more than 50 employees, you're also required to provide FMLA and all of its protections. You should also add all internal time off policies here, including combined and universal time buckets, personal time, bereavement, holidays, and other state mandated leaves like jury duty, voting, blood and bone marrow donation, military leave, etc. Keep in mind, if you are a multi-state employer, you will need to decide whether to offer differing policies to those employees in different states versus coming up with a conservative approach and applying the same policy, usually based on the most stringent employee-friendly state to all employees. Next, be sure to consider generations, culture, and modern work styles, including technology use, remote work if applicable, social media, your AI use policies, etc. And finally, be sure to communicate and distribute the handbook to employees and get signed acknowledgments. Creating the handbook is only half the battle. It doesn't provide all of its protections if you don't have acknowledgments from all employees saying they received it and reviewed it. This should be done on a regular basis, at least annually after updates. So once you've created an employee handbook, whether on your own or with help, how do you keep it current? It's important to realize that an employee handbook is a living document. I think you've probably all heard of that reference that way. It's never static. Regulations change or new requirements get added by federal, state, and local law, and they are definitely not on a regular timeline. Your business may grow and change too, so be sure to review and reevaluate your handbook on a regular basis, whether some of your internal policies make sense, maybe a question you want to review quite often. Make sure that when developed and at least annually thereafter, you have a review done. Best practice is to update the handbook at least annually, keeping in mind that if important rules are enacted within the year, that oftentimes you may need to do that sooner. The time and cost of an annual review is far lower than the cost of compliance violations, contested terminations, or fines and penalties from the Department of Labor or IRS. Many HR consultants, including GTM's team, offer handbook reviews as a package service. GTM can even automate the annual review whereby employers receive regular updates, at least once update to the handbook itself. Although we've mentioned it already, it's important to realize if you have company locations or employees in another state, a single handbook is not sufficient to meet all of the policy and notice requirements. Many employers with even one remote worker in another state may not realize that they need a state addendum. For example, if the remote employee is full-time New York employee working from home in New Jersey, that can trigger New Jersey employment law obligations. GTM's process includes a main handbook that provides the policies that apply to all company employees, and then has a separate state addendum for each state in which there are employees. Employees only receive the state addendum that applies to them to avoid confusion and applying the wrong standards and procedures. Since state law changes much more frequently than federal law, it's especially important to review and update those state mandated policies and notices regularly. To help you get started, we've created a checklist that you can refer to. This checklist is helpful even to audit whether you have these policies to begin with. Then once reviewed and you identify what you have and what you need, you can easily kick off the project with your own HR professionals or with the help of your GTM HR consultant. This checklist will be available as a separate download with the materials sent after this presentation. As you'll see, we've talked about all of these policies throughout the presentation. Be sure to review all areas: foundational compliance policies, leave, compensation and benefits. Walk through each of these items briefly and make sure you are attending to each. Additional policies around technology and privacy, record keeping, and sections related to your own internal policies are also equally as important, and you'll see them on this part of the checklist. These are the areas that are reflective of your culture. Again, this is a great resource that will be shared following today's presentation and a great starting point for your employee handbook. So what happens if you're unable to get to your handbook or put it off, or even worse, do not have one and do not care to have one? Well, that is a very risky venture. There are many risks associated with having either an outdated or missing handbook. And yes, even though the handbook itself is not mandated, not having some of these policies and notices in place and having acknowledgement of them is a violation in some states. Failure to have required policies and notices can result in fines and regulatory action from the Department of Labor. Without clear pay, employee classification, or leave policies, employers may unexpectedly pay employees incorrectly or deny required leave time, causing overtime liability, costly settlements, and thousands in penalties. If there were ever dispute or audit, the absence of documented and or acknowledged policies significantly weakens an employer's ability to defend decisions and actions. This becomes especially difficult to defend in disciplinary and termination matters. Finally, an employer cannot credibly hold employees accountable for a policy that does not exist in writing. Courts and agencies alike side with employees in the absence of documentation, especially in employee-friendly states like New York. With that said, I want to thank you all for attending today and want to turn it back over to Raleigh.
Jen, thank you so much. We appreciate all that you shared with us, and we hope you're going to stick around because we have some questions coming your way. We've had some come through on the questions functionality. Again, a reminder to our participants today, the little box with the question mark on the upper right hand of your screen, you can ask a question in there. We have a number coming up. First, we want to let you know that don't be overwhelmed by all that Jen told you, because GTM can help you with your handbook creation and updates. We can make it simpler for you. One of our experienced HR consultants will work closely with you to develop a handbook that meets the requirements of your organization. Our team has worked on hundreds of handbooks over the years. Our depth of knowledge in workplace policies and best practices ensures that your and your employees' needs are taken into account, and you'll have an employee handbook compliant with state and federal laws. Going to give you peace of mind. So please let us help. All right, Jen, here we go. We've got some questions for you. And as always, we've got a few in the registration process. We'll go to some of these questions first. First one up is the New York State Retail Workplace Violence Prevention Program. Is that still required from last year?
Yes, so it became effective in March of last year. The New York Retail Worker Safety Act mandates that all retail employers with 10 or more employees implement a workplace violence prevention policy. The law was intended to enhance safety measures for retail workers and reduce incidents of workplace violence. Employers must adopt either New York State's Department of Labor's model policy or create their own that meets or exceeds the minimum standards outlined in the law. And the policy must discuss working late and early hours, exchanging money with public, working alone or in small numbers, and uncontrolled access to the workplace. Employers are also required under this law to provide training annually to employees. The training must be interactive and cover risks, de-escalation techniques, and emergency procedures. So very much an important policy to have in your handbook in New York State, and required training to accompany that.
Thank you. Next up, what are the best practices regarding PTO wording and maternity leave policies in the employee handbook?
Paid time off policies are a very important part of the handbook. They should be very clear about not only how much time an employee will have and whether that amount of time changes over the course of years or gets increased with certain anniversary dates. But it's also important to show how time off will be accrued versus being front loaded, if that's the case, whether it will carry over, whether it will be paid out upon separation, and who is eligible to get this time off. Um, Certain categories of time off may apply to full-time and part-time employees. Certain may only apply to full-time. So all of that's really important to include in your policy. It's also important to consider certain paid sick leave requirements, especially if you're in New York State. I find that a lot of companies are deciding to use one bucket of time off for their employees now, which makes administration much easier, whether you're using a payroll app or not. But in those cases, you have to make sure that those policies are very well defined and that they include all the requirements of those paid sick leave needs, as well as any other time off you're providing employees. So the compliance of those combined policies are very important to have reviewed. You should also note whether you require certain notice for time off. That's something that's missed by many employers. You may tell them that they get time off and what they need to do to get that time off, but don't always include a notice requirement. I find that for small employers, it's most important to have that because you don't want people calling in quite regularly and leaving you understaffed. So I think all of those pieces are quite important for those policies, in making sure that you're being very clear in those definitions.
Well, things are always fluid in the workplace and laws change, policies change. How do you suggest it's best to handle mid-year updates to an employee handbook?
Well, like we said, Raleigh, in New York and many other states like New York, changes are coming in, every week, every month. There's no timeline for legislative updates. So many new policies have to be developed mid-year. So not only how do you develop those policies, but how do you communicate them is kind of an important thing to take into consideration when thinking about your employee handbook. They often come throughout the year, which requires you to constantly keep an eye out. So that's the first piece, making sure that you have someone that's looking out for these things, or making sure you're connected with a very well-trusted advisor to keep you updated on those policies. For mid-year changes that affect the policies in the handbook, there are a couple of options. You can communicate the updated policies in regular updates, and those can be communicated via a memo or an email. We often recommend quarterly or mid-year updates, just providing an outline of anything that's been changed since you last circulated your latest version of your handbook. You can also communicate them one-off, so as they come up, but sometimes, employers do not want to overburden employees, especially those that do not sit at a computer all day. None of these mid-year changes need to occur directly in the handbook immediately, or else you can imagine we'd be constantly working on our handbook, and we all have a lot of other important things to do. So usually the handbook itself references that there may be policy updates communicated through the year. And when those are communicated, they should be considered incorporated into the handbook. And then ultimately, before the next year's version of the handbook, those should be all incorporated into the next version.
Here's a question. What's the point of having an employee handbook that's so long, employees don't take the time to even read it?
Well, ultimately, we want employees to read the handbook. That's why we're working on it. That's why we're keeping it updated. We obviously want them to be knowledgeable of the policies and to create expectations. I find it very helpful to review the handbook with new employees as they come on board, as well as annually. When you update the handbook, I typically include a very short training with the entire employee population to discuss policies that are either very important. Those are usually the state mandated ones. Those that have had changes, I usually like to touch on those and answer any questions related to those. But I don't necessarily need all employees to sit down and read every page of a handbook in front of me and then acknowledge that they did. I like to use it as a resource should they have a question about it. I always include a table of contents at the beginning of the handbook so they can literally use it as a resource. So as a question comes up in their mind, they can simply refer to the table of contents and find the respective policy in the handbook and use it as a reference. I find it's very helpful for managers to use it as a reference as well, especially when employees are coming to them with HR questions and they obviously are not, necessarily HR professionals. They'll at least have a resource to refer to.
Question about whistleblower policy. Do you have a sample whistleblower policy you could share? One that's not on this particular person's radar, and they're in New York. That wasn't on their radar till today.
Yes.
How can you help?
Yeah, we have many whistleblower templates. You can also find some of the model policies on the Department of Labor website. I usually cite the Department of Labor website in New York as one of the best resources we have. They're really good at describing the guidance related to certain mandated policies and rules in there, including some of the mandated time off, whistleblower provisions, the electronic monitoring provisions, etc. There's usually a model policy that you can pull right from that website and then certainly customize to your organization. But we at GTM, we absolutely have a template that we could share with anyone who's participating in this presentation. So if you'd like to reach out following the presentation, we'd be happy to share that with you.
The question, this employer says we require employees not to be on their cell phones during the workday at a preschool setting. Can they require employees not to use those cell phones in a preschool setting while in the workplace like that?
Yes, many workplaces have no cell phone use during the day. They have many ways to manage that policy if they do have it. Certainly in um, industries like childcare and industries that include driving very dangerous equipment, et cetera, that can be, perceived as pretty obvious. If they do require employees to use their personal devices, however, to either log into their computers or any of the systems or that they're using as part of their employment, then they will need to very specifically provide authorization for use of those devices to log in, and then what they should be doing with them, whether it be storing them away or what the case may be for them during the workday. But no employer is required to allow an employee to use their personal device while they're working.
That's kind of related in terms of what's proper in the workplace. Should there be something in the handbook about not using marijuana during the workday? Even though it's legal, they do have, this particular employer does have an alcohol policy, no alcohol policy. Should they just stick it in there with that? Anything special that needs to be done with marijuana?
No, no, and actually the reference to the no alcohol policy is a really good one. That's how I usually just start my discussions about a marijuana smoking policy. So just like alcohol, marijuana is legal in some states. It's not federally legal yet, but in some states it certainly is legal, but you still cannot be under the influence at work, whether it be by alcohol or be by marijuana or any other drug. So you can incorporate no smoking, no marijuana in your no smoking policy. You can incorporate it into your no substance policy, or you can simply add it to your no alcohol policy. Certainly, if you have policies related to testing, that would be included as part of the testing. Both alcohol and marijuana can be tested for if you have any reasonable suspicion of people being under the influence in the workplace. However, I would recommend adding them to a policy so they are there to provide the protection for the employer should they want to send someone for that type of testing during the workday, or be able to at least relieve someone of their duty during the workday because they suspect that they've used, whether it be alcohol, marijuana, or some other drug.
Suggest any templates? I think you have suggested that for handbooks. Here's someone working with a different payroll provider and said that theirs is not user friendly at all. They've heard that SHRM has one. What do you suggest? How can you help along that line?
Yeah, I think that, SHRM is a great resource. If you're a member of SHRM, you can get any policy that's required federally or in any state. There's a lot of other resources out there that are trusted research sites to provide sample policies. But again, I want, especially in New York State, I think a great reference is that New York State Department of Labor website. You can provide a lot of model policies on there, especially for the mandated um, policies and things that notices that need to be communicated in New York State. So I think that's a good starting point. It is difficult just to Google because, sometimes it's a combination of information that's being pulled with AI being utilized in some of these search engines now. So it's very difficult to be able to rely on a purely Google search without using a more reputable service behind it. And again, you can always reach out to HR consultants at GTM. We have a full employee handbook department that does everything from full employee handbook projects to providing policy drafting if it's only a couple policies that you need help with. And we, as part of that department, we have someone who is continuously keeping our team as well as our employee handbook templates up to date based on the ever-changing landscape that goes on, whether it be federally, state, or locally.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all the great knowledge. We say it again, great job. We appreciate you. A lot of good information. However, if you still have questions, right there on your screen, you can see Jen's contact information. You can reach out to her if you'd like more support about a handbook or other HR services. You can also talk to our HR sales consultant, Andrew Gowinski. His information's right there on your screen as well. Thank you. That's all the time we have for questions. If you have any additional questions about employee handbooks, feel free to reach out and talk to us directly. And if you're interested about learning more about GTM's employee handbook or HR audit services, talk to Andrew and be watching for the email coming later today with a video recording of this presentation so you won't forget any of the great points that Jen shared with you. And we'll also send you a PDF version of today's presentation. Thank you for joining us today. Jen, thanks again. Everybody
Thanks,
have a
Raleigh.
great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.